Hey students, it's Miss Wicks. Today we're going to be briefly discussing absolutism in Europe, which is very, very crucial for understanding a lot of the events of the 16 and 1700s. We're going to see that there is some tension in some countries because they have monarchs who are trying to set this type of a system up, or they're trying to continue an absolutist system that was already in place with varying degrees of success. And that's really going to become a key issue in the next couple of chapters we're looking at. So today's conversation is very important for really getting a lot of the events of the 16 and 1700s. So a few things I want to mention here as background information or context. The 1600s or the 17th century is an age of intense conflict and crisis. In class, I always joke with my students that if the doctor from Doctor Whoever picked me up in the time machine, the TARDIS, I would not go back to the 1600s. There's a lot of chaos happening here, not just with regards to wars of religion like the 30 Years' War, but there's also a mini ice age happening. We've got the witchcraft craze also happening. There's just a lot of conflict. So again, there's constant warfare in different places. There's, what many consider is that First World War with the 30 Years' War, some historians kind of compare it to. And there's just a lot going on. So there's a challenge to European governments. And the question is, how do we maintain order and give the nation? How do we give the government sufficient power to compete internationally? How do we create a government that has enough power to protect the people and to rise to all these different challenges? So the solution for a lot of places is to, the monarch thinks anyway, that the solution is to create absolute monarchies. So the key here is the word absolute. The idea is that this person would have almost or complete total power over their people, over their nobles, even over the church itself. And we're going to see that, there's a lot of things happening that make absolute monarchy possible. Again, if we had a king in the Middle Ages who tried to take this type of power, it wouldn't have happened because the Pope was there at the top of the great chain of being. And the Pope had political power, and the Pope would be really the only person in Europe who would keep a king in check, who could ask a king to go on crusade and so forth. So in the 1500s, we start seeing the so-called new monarchies, people like Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, people like Henry VIII, even Philip II tried this, where they're trying to take power from the nobles, they're trying to consolidate their power within the throne. So again, that slow process is possible because the church has started to lose political power, and then that really picks up after the Reformation. And of course, many of these countries have shifting wealth because of the colonies. We're going to see that Spain is, of course, going to have a huge shift in their country because of the great wealth coming in. But colonial policies and economic situations are also going to play a role. So we're going to see that an absolute monarch is someone who has consolidated enough power that they can do pretty much anything that they want. So in this unit, we're talking about several successful absolute monarchs, people like Louis XIV of France or Peter the Great of Russia. We have other kings or monarchs who are not as successful as Louis and Peter were in consolidating their power. We're going to see in this unit the tale of the English Civil War, where we have Charles I trying to really take power from Parliament and not really able to do that successfully. So again, the idea here is that the monarch can do anything. And the philosophy behind that was many kings of that era believed that they had divine rights or God-given power to rule. So you've got your little social hierarchy here, or the great chain of being as we've been referring to it, where you've got God at the top and then the monarch right underneath them. So many of the kings and many of the monarchs of that time had the theory that they could get away with behaviors that you or I might be challenged for because God likes them better. And the theory is, again, that, the the king's will is also reflected by God's will. So, again, we're not going to see a lot of people, really willing to challenge the rights of an absolute monarch, because there's some religious thought behind that as well. So again, I'm not going to say that there weren't rebellions, because there were, but in many places people were more reluctant to rebel because of the divine right theory. So long-term causes, again, we looked at um, the shifting of power with like the rise of new monarchies, the decline of feudalism. That's really going to hamper the power of these aristocratic landowners, and so forth. So absolute monarchy only really works if you have control over your nobles. Again, in the Middle Ages, we saw many examples of nobles who were so-called overmighty subjects, and they had just enough power and enough pull that they could really, really make trouble for the authorities. So again, the loss of church authority, the loss of the aristocratic authority, those are some of the factors that will cause absolute monarchs to be able to take more power. So getting into what absolutism looks like, if we call it a king an absolute monarch, what that means is that they really don't have to take any kind of advice or consideration from a legislative branch, or from any kind of privy council. They may choose to have advisors, but really the key power is within the monarchy. So the sovereign holds the power, and again, it's seen as like God-given right to rule. So again, this person may choose to have advisors, they may choose to have a council, but the king may or may not really listen to them. So it really just depended on the king and who, what their agenda was, and how much they trusted their advisors. But again, some of these absolute monarchs are able to rule pretty much on their own. They may designate and delegate work to other people, but their true power lies with the monarch. So again, the king is making the laws, the king is levying taxes, and that's really going to be an issue in some countries, like England, for example. Their big problem with Charles I is that he was messing with their traditional power, going back to the Magna Carta, their power to levy taxes. So again, Charles is trying to get around what had been like an ancient prerogative of Parliament, and that's really where they're going to have an issue with Charles trying to become more of an absolute monarch. The king is also administering justice, the king controls the army, and again, compare that to the Middle Ages before the rise of the new monarchs. How a king would raise an army is by convincing the aristocrats to bring their knights with them. So many of the countries in the Middle Ages did not have their own national standing army. They had to really rely on the goodwill of their nobles. So that's really going to be a key change with our new monarchs, like Henry VIII, for example. Henry VIII doesn't want to rely upon his nobles' goodwill. He's going to create his own navy. So again, he's controlling the army. He doesn't have to ask people to go to war. He's telling them. And we're going to see again that the king is going to determine foreign policy, control domestic policy, and all this power rests in one person. So, limits of absolutism. Again, depending on the country, depending on the situation, many of these kings had varying degrees of success. Of course, they want to rule over every element of their people's lives. Some are more successful than others. We'll see later with Peter the Great that he even had a beard tax. He hated the big bushy beards that were popular in Russia at that time. So he created a tax system where if you wanted to keep your beard, you had to buy a token to show that you had paid your beard tax. So again, a lot of these monarchs are trying to push their authority. Some have more success than others. Again, some of these monarchs relied upon censorship of the press. Some of them, relied upon the church to help them spread some of their political messaging. And again, they're trying to gain as much power as possible. Some of the local institutions still had some power, particularly in bigger empires where like it's like take Russia, for example. Russia is so geographically large that it would be really impossible for a single king, a single person to rule over every element, every decision that had to be made. And we're going to see later in the course that the Romanovs got into some trouble when they tried to consolidate all that power, when they were afraid to delegate to trusted ministers, that bogged things down. They weren't able to make efficient decisions, and that's going to cause a problem. So again, that's an issue, for example, with Philip II of Spain. He has a hard time delegating, he has a hard time trusting people, and he rules over this giant Spanish empire. He's got colonies all over the world, literally. So again, the fact that the king wanted his hand in every decision is really going to make things tough. So the king determined the ultimate policy, but the most successful absolute monarchs are going to disseminate their power through local agents. So the local agents or the city council or the local mayor, they're going to carry out the king's wishes. And of course the king's going to set the agenda, but the locals are going to be in charge of administering that. So successful absolute monarchs are going to work and figure out how to work within traditional systems to keep and establish control. So again, you're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. You're still respecting that there is a city council, that there's a city mayor, and you're going to convince those people to work with you. You're not creating a whole new system. So I wanted to mention that there are two types of constitutional governments. As we look at this era, the big push is between an absolute monarchy and a constitutional monarchy. If we have a constitutional monarchy like England has today, the English monarch, which currently is Elizabeth II, as of the time of recording this, she serves as the head of state. That person may have some residual political authority, but ultimately the power rests with the people. So when Elizabeth the second is hosting visitors who come to the country, if the president visits England, if there's a state visit, she's got a ceremonial role. She's there as an ambassador, but she's not going to set the agenda for Parliament. And again, the English Queen today really tries to stay out of politics as much as possible because she's supposed to be above all of that. So she's very careful about not endorsing political candidates or outwardly favoring one person over the other. She has to be very, very neutral. Okay. A constitutional republic is what the American colonies will set up after the American Revolution. So again, we did away with, I'm an American, so we did away with the king. We said no thank you to George III. And the sovereign power doesn't reside with a king. It's exercised by representatives. The power is residing with the people and administered through chosen representatives. So again, just giving some examples. And I'm just going to say today, most of the monarchies of the world are constitutional monarchies today. We really don't have a ton of examples of somebody who would have absolute power. There are a few, but many of the long-standing monarchies like King Philippe of Spain, for example. He's actually from the House of Bourbon. His family came to Spain and took over the throne after the War of Spanish Succession, and it's a constitutional role. So again, there is a government apparatus, and he is there as like a government figurehead. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up today, I wanted to just talk to you quickly about absolutism versus constitutionalism. So the idea here with an absolute ruler is that they have or want to have or will try to have total power. The laws are arbitrary. The laws are at the king's desire or at the king's command. The taxation is by order. And if there's a representative body The representative body either isn't allowed to meet very often or they don't have a lot of power. So, for example, in France, we're going to see that yes, they had a type of Congress or parliament called the Estates General, but they're not allowed to meet very often. So, yes, technically on paper, the people have representation, but it's not effective representation. That representative body is not driving the decision making. Okay. Whereas in a constitutional government, which is where England will be by the end of the 1600s, we're going to see that the government has limited power. Okay. That the laws are by common consent, that taxation is by consent. Again, the laws are going to be usually in a constitutional system structured to where the legislative branch has the power to raise taxes or levy taxes for war. We don't have a king who's just going to decide to go to war and tax us to pay for that. The representative bodies in the constitutional system have an immense amount of power, and then the sovereignty lies with the people. So, again, some key differences there. Again, there are constitutional monarchies. So, again, those are places that may have a king or queen, they may have a head of state, but again, that person is in a more ceremonial role and they don't have the power that like Louis the 14th would have had hundreds of years ago. Okay? So again, guys, just to kind of wrap up today, in the 1600s and into the 1700s, the kings of Europe and the monarchs, they wanted to be in that absolutism column as much as they could. Of course, we're going to see that there is some pushback against that. And that pushback against absolutism is really going to pick up steam when we start getting into the Enlightenment. When we start having people like Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau talking about what an ideal government would look like, how much participation the people should have in that government, that's really where people are going to gain some ideas and gain some confidence to challenge this absolutism model. Okay, have a wonderful day. I hope we can kind of keep this in mind as we're going through the chapter and, given some perspective. If I understand what absolutism is, it really helps me understand the goals of Louis the 14th. It helps me understand more why he built Versailles. He's trying to run the table. He's trying to control everybody. So if he lives in this palace, that he controls every element of, he's able to use that palace for political reasons, and it raises his power. So it really gives us some insight into the motivations that many of these leaders had. Okay, have a wonderful day. Thank you, guys.